pregnant Israeli woman is stabbed by a Palestinian assailant in the West Bank town of Tekoa. This as a Jewish mother of 6 is laid to rest a day after being killed in a terror attack in Otniel. Iran's president announces he will travel to France and Italy next week following a visit to Tehran by China's leader. The news comes as the Islamic Republic moves to boost oil output by 500,000 barrels per day. Professional tennis is rocked by allegations that the game's authorities failed to deal with widespread match fixing as the world's #1 player admits he was approached by gamblers. Good evening and welcome to the news today. We begin with news from the last hour. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Dan Shapiro made a controversial statement at the INSS conference today, saying Israel has a double standard when applying the law to Palestinians and to Jews in Judea and Samaria. This brought up fears that delegitimization of Israel could soon increase. And we are joined now live from the INSS conference by I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Tal Shalev. Tal, good evening. A very strong statement. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, Ayman, there's a very tough talk from the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro. On a usual day, one of the most popular and liked American officials in the Obama administration here in Israel. But in his speech here today at the Institute of National Security Studies, Shapiro directs tough and harsh critique towards the Israeli government's policy in the West Bank, and specifically towards the rule of law and what he calls an inadequate response to settlers' violence. Shapiro notes that despite the fact that the indictments of the Duma murderers were important, it appears at times that Israel adheres to two different standards of rule of law, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians. And just hours later, we hear a very harsh response from the Prime Minister's office, who slammed the comments as untrue, incorrect, and unacceptable on the day that a mother of 6 is buried and another mother was attacked in terror attacks in the West Bank. Let's hear what Shapiro had to say.
We are concerned and perplexed by Israel's strategy on settlements. This government and previous Israeli governments have repeatedly expressed their support for a negotiated two-state solution. Yet separation will become more and more difficult if Israeli plans to continue to expand the footprint of settlements. What is Israel's plan for resolving the conflict, for remaining a Jewish and democratic state? And if it judges a political solution to be out of reach for the time being, then what is its plan for managing and stabilizing the conflict in the short and medium term?
Yes, that was U.S. Ambassador to Israel Dan Shapiro. Tal, of course, relations between Jerusalem and the Obama administrations have been strained, to say the least. Will this worsen ties between the two countries?
Well, just last week, the Israeli Prime Minister told foreign reporters, foreign journalists, that the relationship with the United States is just fine. But I think that these comments today by the U.S. Ambassador to Israel show that the American administration is very much unpleased with the Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians, and with the diplomatic stalemate, we can assume that Shapiro's comments were approved and generated actually in Washington, D.C. But this is an existing tension between Washington and Jerusalem. Even before this segment of his speech, Shapiro talked about the prospects of cooperation, but it is clear that Jerusalem and Washington do not agree upon this, and that there is growing impatience in the United States to the Israeli government's policies. This is the second time within a week that the U.S. has voiced concerns from some of the Israeli government actions. So definitely this will probably continue to escalate in the upcoming days.
Yes, our I-24 News diplomatic correspondent Tal Shalev standing by for us in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much for that. And we're moving now to news from Israel. A pregnant Israeli woman is in moderate condition after being stabbed by a Palestinian assailant in the West Bank town of Tekoa this morning. The attack comes a day after an Israeli mother of 6 was killed in her home in Otniel by an assailant. I-24 News defense correspondent Shai Ben Ari reports.
Terrorist attacks hit West Bank settlements in quick succession over the past 2 days. A 17-year-old Palestinian armed with a knife broke into a clothing warehouse Monday morning in Tkoa, south of Jerusalem. He proceeded to stab a pregnant woman in her 30s multiple times in her upper body. The woman, Michal Fruman, suffered moderate injuries and was rushed to hospital in Jerusalem. The assailant was shot by an armed resident who was nearby. The attacker was seriously injured and received treatment from Israeli paramedics who arrived at the scene. Michal Fruman is the daughter-in-law of the late Rabbi Menachem Fruman, a peace activist who devoted his life to forging reconciliation between Jewish and Muslim religious leaders. At the time of the incident in Tkoa, memorial ceremonies were already underway further south for 39-year-old Daphne Meir, who was murdered the night before in a similar attack.
You can no longer shout now. So I will shout for you. Daphne, God, we ask you, enough.
A Palestinian broke into Meir's home in the settlement of Otniel and began stabbing her with a knife. Daphne Meir struggled against the terrorist, while 3 of her 6 children were in the house. After stabbing her numerous times, the assailant escaped the settlement. Meir was later pronounced dead by medics who arrived at the scene. The children were unharmed.
The terrorist was unable to remove the knife from the body of the mother and was therefore unable to kill the daughter who was nearby.
If you live in an environment where they name streets after people who murder, and they call these people saints, they call them holy people, shahids, then this is an environment that encourages evil things, terror, and violence.
The army conducted overnight searches for the perpetrator, who was thought to have fled to one of the surrounding villages.
The village was heavily raided and they arrested a bunch of young men. People were detained until 3 in the morning. So far, they have arrested 4 people and a lot of doors were broken because the owners weren't inside.
The terrorist was still on the run Monday afternoon.
Yes, and I'm joined now in studio by Jacques Neria, former deputy head for assessment of Israeli military intelligence. Mr. Neria, good evening.
Good evening.
You know, Mr. Neria, we discussed over the past 2 weeks to a great degree the missions of security forces in Israel and their degree of success, of course, after the terror attack in Tel Aviv by Nash'at Milham, which left 3 people dead. He was on the run for a week until he was caught. And now the pursuit after this terrorist is still ongoing. It seems to me like the biggest issue for Israeli citizens is, do we have reasons to worry? Are security forces succeeding really in keeping us safe?
Well, you know, basically you could say yes. I mean, after all, 8 million Jews are living in Israel, and you know, if you compare only to a fraction to what's happening on the roads, then these terrorist attacks do not represent really a great threat to the existence of the state of Israel. It is a bug, and it's an annoying one, but still, I mean, people can go to the beach, can have coffee in the streets, and I think life is going on in Tel Aviv and elsewhere in Israel. And I believe that our services, the Shabak and others, are very effective, and they have been deploying themselves, stretching themselves a lot lately. But basically, you cannot stop individuals like in the incidents that we had in those 2 last days, or even in like Nash'at Milham. At the time, people who decide that without any previous knowledge about their activities to just go and stab Jews or kill Jews or shoot at Jews, use weapons that they have at home. This is very difficult. I mean, you can easily trace cells, organizations, networks, but when it comes to individuals, as you call them, lonely wolves who come out of the bush and attack, this is very difficult. The only way to defend is just to adopt more and more defensive approach around places like Tekoa and other places. Just close the villages, the settlements, and just to be much more alert to who comes to those areas.
Well, on the point of defensive measures, let's bring into the conversation our defense correspondent, Shai Ben-Uri. Shai, good evening. Can you tell us about the progress of security forces in Israel in apprehending the terrorists today?
Well, really, searches go on in the area around the settlement of Otniel in the southern West Bank and the villages surrounding that settlement. A lot of focus on the village of Karma And we know that besides the IDF, other security services are also involved in this effort. So we're talking about also an intelligence effort, very sensitive sort of effort that involves intelligence within these Arab villages. When you talk about the incident this morning in Tkoa, we're talking about a settlement which is inside the Gush Etzion settlement block. Now, there have been numerous incidents, even in the current terror wave, in this area. But it has to be said, Gush Etzion, basically an element of coexistence, is maintained even today, despite the terror wave that is in force. You have, on a day-to-day basis, Palestinians working in these Jewish communities, and today that was also true. Following the attack, the regional IDF commander ordered the removal of all Palestinians who work inside these Jewish communities, and they are not expected to be allowed entrance tomorrow either. This is not the first time this has happened. But it's really, you could say, tragic, perhaps, even when you talk about the victim of today's attack. Michal Fruman, of course, is the daughter-in-law of Rabbi Menachem Fruman, who dedicated many efforts to the sort of reconciliation between religious leaders. And he, in fact, was also a teacher in Otniel, in the settlement where the previous attack last night occurred.
Yes, Shai Ben-Ari joining us to elaborate on this story. Thank you very much. Mr. Neria, 2 terror attacks in 2 days. We ask this question often. Are we in the midst of another escalation, this time of lone wolf attacks?
We are in an escalation mood. And there's nothing to change to change our assessment about it. We're in the midst of a sort of popular popular wolves. You have herds coming all over the areas, and this is the aftershock coming from Raqqa in Syria. Definitely those people are inspired by what's going on in Twitter, in the networks, social networks, and in the ideology of Daesh. And this is and the way they accomplish their attacks. It's a solo jihad. This is exactly what the ideologists of Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra would like to have.
And let's talk about the victims of this terrorism. We're joined now on the phone from Tkoa by Mark Zell. Mark, good evening. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Great to be here. I should say not so great for this reason, but good to talk to you.
Yes, we're very happy to have you. And of course, we realize that there must be a sense of grief and possibly fear in the larger community in Tkoa following this murder. Can you tell us how the community is coping today?
Well, this is not the first time that something like this has happened. I mean, just 34 years ago, one of our members was stabbed to death by Arabs in villages nearby, and he was guarding the Herodian National Monument. And a few years after that, a good friend of mine, Mordechai Lipkin, was ambushed and murdered in cold blood on his way here to Tkoa. So, and there are others, but this is always when it happens. Of course, this happened inside our village, and that's something that's disturbing to everyone. But you have to understand that Tkoa is a place that's filled with people that are very open-minded about cooperating with all types of people, Arabs and Jews, Christians, Muslims, and so on. Our Rabbi Fruman, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But this is a time of shock and concern, but the people are strong, and they're meeting even as we speak to discuss it.
Yes, and you mentioned, of course, the Fruman family who sustained today's attack. Can you tell us about your relationship with the family?
Well, I was a very good friend of the late Rabbi Menachem Fruman, who was known all over Israel for his charity and his warm-heartedness and his openness to people of all ideas and persuasion, and particularly, and this is why today's attack is especially ironic, considering that he led and was really quite unique in his attempt to reach out to religious leaders in the Muslim community to establish bridges of peace with them in dialogue. This is something he did throughout his life. He dedicated himself to this, and so was the family that was dedicated to really welcoming people of all types. And here, with the height of irony, to have their daughter-in-law stabbed in her 18th week of pregnancy in a store that itself was set up to collect clothes for the needy. I mean, there's at every way you look at this tragic event, irony really stares you in the face.
Yes, Mark Zal, thank you very much for talking to us. And of course, from here, we extend our well wishes and strength to you there in Tekoa. Jacques Neria, you're staying with us.
I wonder about that. What would the Swedish foreign minister say about that?
Well, it relates to the next topic we're going to discuss, and of course you're staying with us for that as well. We're moving to Iran. With most sanctions on Iran lifted, President Rouhani announced today he will visit France and Italy next week, following an expected visit from China's leader this weekend. It comes as Tehran moved today to boost oil output by 500,000 barrels per day. Eli Hochenberg has more.
Even though it was a lengthy process and preparations were underway for a while, the transition itself was quick. Iran is back in business. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani is expected to visit Italy and France next week and hold meetings with leaders, politicians, and even Pope Francis, in what signals, maybe more than anything else, the beginning of the post-sanctions era. But mutual suspicion is far from being the story of the past, especially in light of the newly imposed American sanctions on Iran due to its ballistic missiles tests.
We don't intend to trust countries like the United States simply because of the nuclear agreement. There are some mechanisms that we will use to solve disputes if they violate the agreement.
While renewed relations are yet to be on the right track, old ones are only strengthening.
We would not forget our friends who have helped us during the difficult days we suffered sanctions.
Chinese President Xi Jinping will launch his Middle Eastern tour on Wednesday, visiting Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iran, with the aim of consolidating ties and engaging in solving regional disputes. Meanwhile, Japan announced it is moving to, quote, swiftly remove economic sanctions on Tehran.
Not only are we strengthening the traditionally friendly relations with Iran, but we also plan on playing a part in helping Iran recover the trust of the region for the peace and stability of the Middle East.
And the process of rejuvenating its economy is already looming, as Iran has issued an order to increase oil production by 500,000 barrels per day, while global oil prices remain under pressure. In a direct connection, efforts to reduce tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia continue, with Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif taking off for a rapid visit in Riyadh and Tehran. Islamabad is seeking to avoid taking sides in the escalating sectarian battle in light of its large communities of both Shiite and Sunni Muslims.
Yes, and joining myself and Jacques Neria in the studio right now are Avi Melamed, Head of Intelligence and Middle East Affairs at the Eisenhower Institute. Good evening.
Good evening.
And diplomatic correspondent for the news today, Eli Hochenberg. Good evening to you as well, Eli. Mr. Melamed, what can we make of this visit by Iran to Europe?
Well, Iran is now celebrating a new chapter in its relations with the world. I mean, as far as the Iranian regime is now concerned, this is a very positive development. Obviously, we can see that it opens all the gates, relatively speaking, and the Iranians are now resuming their connection with the world, obviously trying to gain momentum out of the situation. But it was well expected. It's not very surprising to see that. And that was, it's very clear. What we're going to see now is more and more that the European companies will be more and more interested in resuming connections in Iran, in resuming investments in Iran and so forth. Iran, of course, is looking forward to renew its connections to the markets. So as far as the Iranian regime is concerned, obviously this is a positive development.
And Ali, aside from the economic developments, of course, we're likely to see large changes on the diplomatic level.
Absolutely. Well, if I may start with the Pakistani position, which is very, very complex. First of all, we're talking about a Muslim nuclear power, and that is important to mention. And when it comes to the Saudi-Iranian spat, Pakistan seeks to remain as neutral as possible because it has large-scale communities of both Shiite and Sunni Muslims, so it does not want to get into this, sectarian mess. But on the other hand, we've heard Pakistani officials reaffirming Saudi Arabia that if its territorial sovereignty will be threatened by any activity, it will respond, and it will respond forcefully. And when we're talking about nuclear power, the ramifications positions are clear. But the main goal at the moment of Iran is to stay with good terms both with Russia and with the U.S. Because that will allow it to expand its regional influence, which of course we know it is something Tehran is much eager to do. So it will try to remain on the best side of both powers, Russia and the U.S., and it will be very difficult to maneuver in this very tricky road, I may say.
A very tricky road. And Mr. Niriyad, when we consider the extremely complicated past between Iran and Saudi Arabia, does Pakistan stand a chance playing peacemaker between the two?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, this is a first in history, seeing the Pakistani intervention between those two countries. Basically, Pakistan is very pro-Saudi. So I mean, the bias is very clear here. So I don't know how they could fit in trying to be the intermediary between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But going back to Iran, I think that the Arab popular saying that if you see the teeth of a lion, do not think that the lion is smiling. So this is what's happening. In fact, I mean, this is an offensive of a big smile of Iran being accepted by the world, and the world is very interested. You know, only today we've heard that they are going to buy about 120 planes from Airbus. So this is a $10 billion deal, and so on and so on. And this is only the beginning, and the Europeans are just ready for that. They want that. They want it, and you just mentioned earlier that. You couldn't find a room in Tehran. It's been 6 months that you can't find a room there. All the businessmen coming from all over Europe and, of course, from America also are there, and they are just waiting for the sign the contract.
If I may add to that, so Rouhani himself explicitly said today that Iran will not forget its old friends that stood by Tehran in the rough times, and the fact that there is now a nuclear agreement is not making Iranians oversee other violations. They see it as violations such as the new sanctions on the ballistic missiles issue. So it will all get very dramatic, I can assure you that.
And despite all of this, the one question for the U.S. and certainly for Israel is, of course, is Iran still a threat, even after complying with all the rules that it should have complied with in order for the sanctions to be lifted? How close will it be to an atomic bomb if it should violate the terms that it is under right now? Is Iran really still a threat to the West, what we call the West?
Iran is a very serious challenge. Before even talking about nuclear power, here is the picture today so we can understand. Right now there are 8 different arenas in the Middle East where you basically have in a different level of intensity a power struggle, a direct collision, sometimes indirect collision between, roughly a way to put it, Arab states and Sunnis on the one hand, and Iran and Shiite militias, proxies of the Iranians in different arenas. You have Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Bahrain, 3 islands are occupied by the Iranians in the Gulf states, Yemen, Gaza Strip, and the nuclear project. Here is something that we have to understand and remember about this regime in Iran. In the last generation, this regime, under the slogan of the resistance, basically is gladly, cynically sacrificing Israelis, Palestinians, Syrians, Lebanese, Iraqis, Yemenites, and so forth. This is a very dangerous regime. Now, this is before talking about the nuclear capacities. For the time being and in the foreseeable future, as I said many times, we are not yet in a nuclear arm race in the Middle East, but we are one step closer following the Vienna Agreement. But people have to understand the danger of the Iranian regime doesn't start when you talk about the nuclear capacities. It's already there. This is a very dangerous regime. When you look today in different parts of the Middle East, you could see that this regime is deep into the blood, sort of speaking, either directly or using its proxies in different arenas.
Well, on that note, let's take a look at what Lieutenant General Gary Eisenkot had to say about this very topic today at the INSS conference.
There is no doubt that the nuclear agreement between Iran and world powers is a strategic turning point. It's a significant change in the vector along which Iran has traveled. and it is also a change in the way we look at things. There are many threats, but there are also opportunities. Naturally, the job of the army and my job is to look at the threats and the capabilities and to make our judgments.
Yes, Mr. Neria, Lieutenant General Eisenkot mentions that there are also opportunities. What are these opportunities that we should
we have 10 years now. 10 years to use the best way we know in order to prepare ourselves to the next decade, see when Iran will decide, if it decides to become nuclear. Right now, Iran has been set back. The whole program has been set back and on a freeze. And Iran would, after decision, could have made a bomb in 2 months. Now it would take a year. So, this is the big advantage. This is the big opportunity. Now, if you use this time in order to prepare yourself, let's go back to the Romans who used to say, "Si vis pacem para bellum." If you want peace, just prepare yourself to war.
Avi Melamed, would you agree? If you want peace, prepare yourself for war?
Always and mostly in this very troubled neighborhood, but I have to say something else about it. It's not only opportunities in the context of the Iranians, it's also opportunities, not negating the dangers and the challenges. We also, when talking about Israel, there are some very interesting strategic developments that are outcome of the massive Iranian brutal, aggressive foreign policy in the region that basically presents today Israel in a very interesting, unprecedented set of conditions and environment and circumstances that basically could result in some interesting positive results as far as Israel is concerned, strategically speaking. It all goes back to the question whether the Israeli political leadership will know how to take this advantage. This is an open question.
We took the first step by meeting the Saudis and having the first Saudi-Israeli meeting in Washington, which I took part. But basically, I would say that we should be very careful in allying ourselves with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, two very archaic regimes, despotic regimes, undemocratic, whose I would say record on human rights is very, very problematic.
Ali Hachenberg, you have the impossible challenge of telling us in 1 minute what are the challenges for the political regime in Israel, which Avi Melamed referred us to.
It is a big challenge, but I will say that I think it will be, I don't know how funny will it be for Europe or the US if it will happen, but if the Saudi initiative, the Arab League initiative, will be the one to bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The Europeans and Washington will not be so pleased about that, and that will definitely change the entire situation here in the Middle East.
Seems to me like almost every side we've discussed tonight, maybe aside from Iran, is not too pleased about the outcome. Gentlemen and lady, thank you very much for being with me this evening for this debate on Iran. A 2-minute break now, and the news today will be back with much more, so stay with us.